The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts, Debi and Sam.
Today's topic is the commodification of pregnancy. This is going to be a solo episode that Sam and I are doing alone. And before we get started, we wanted to just kind of give a little disclaimer. First of all, nothing is ever super graphic or inappropriate on here. But if you do have young children, you may want to preview this before letting them listen because the topics themselves are fairly adult in nature. We're going to be talking about things that you may or may not want your children to hear. So we just wanted to give that disclaimer. And then also to say that we're going to be talking about some kind of tricky things today. We're talking about egg harvesting and IVF and surrogacy, which can be sort of tricky topics to discuss. And so neither one of us are medical professionals. We're not lawyers, and we have no condemnation for anybody that's done any of these procedures. I mean, everyone does the best that they can with the information that they have, and things like infertility are really tough for people to walk through, and you do the best as you can, and every child, no matter how they were conceived, is valuable in the eyes of God. And so we just want to say that at the beginning, that this conversation, what we're hoping to do is just to bring up some things that people don't know about. We're still sorting through a lot of this information ourselves, but it's something that we haven't heard a lot of conversation about and feel like it's something important to discuss and to look into where some of this stuff comes from and some of the issues that come up from those three topics. So, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know if you want to start it off or...
Yes. Should we get into it?
Sure. Let's just dive in and... all right. Here we go.
Yes. The reproductive science. Well, I just want to give a little bit of background for reproductive science. In today's world, we can categorize it into basically 4 broad stages: fertilization, implementation, embryo development, and then fetal development. And so today, when we're discussing reproductive science and all the risks associated with that, it'll be all the things that happen within those stages.
Yeah.
Okay, so my first question / topic that we want to get into is, what is egg harvesting?
Yeah, so that is such a scary thing, really, honestly. And it's one of those things that's funny. I was talking about this, and my youngest daughter, who's 18, she turns 19 this week, but she was telling me she gets ads all the time wanting her to sell her eggs online. And I know even back when I was in college, it was starting. I mean, that was, a million years ago, but it's been something that a lot of college-age girls especially are targeted to sell their eggs. Yes. Egg harvesting, it's something that you can, it's like trying to get you to donate blood or plasma or whatever, but then egg harvesting is a whole different thing because we'll get into the specifics of it because I think you have a different specific question, but it's not the same as like sperm donation or blood or whatever, because it's not something that just naturally happens because women only release 1, sometimes 2, but usually just most of the time 1 egg per month. But in order to harvest eggs, they have to do crazy things to your body to force you to hyperproduce, where you're producing multiple eggs at once, and just the different things that go along with that.
Well, and I was like, it's incentivized too for them, just these women, right?
Correct.
The
They're being paid for it,
because it's college age women that they're really trying to target, and normally these women are trying to pay for themselves to go through college, which makes it look very appealing, but there are downside effects that might not be talked about to them. Yeah.
And it's one of those things, I mean, it seems like, when you're at that age, money's tight and you don't necessarily think about long term. We had a conversation in one other episode about, people being tricked to drive things across the border and ending up in federal prison because they, get paid to haul something across the border and they don't even really think through what they're doing, right? Yep. And this is a similar kind of thing where you're offering young women a lot of money to sell something that they don't necessarily see the value in what they have, number one. And number two, they're not given the information, or they don't really do investigation thoroughly to find out the long-term, even the short-term risks that are associated with that whole procedure. Because it's a whole really, I was reading.
Full disclosure.
I was reading on this, and I'm pretty hard to. I talk about and read about a lot of really icky things, right? In just the work that I do and the stuff that I look into, and this was freaking me out. I'm reading it and like, oh, this is just awful. Yes. So I'm not gonna gross you out. But if you want to be kept up at night. Go into a deep dive on what the process entails and the specifics of it. But the general thing is that they will stop your ovulation, which is not good, right? Because anything that you do to interfere with your natural
biology,
your natural cycle is harmful. We've learned more and more that that's harmful to women. So they stop the cycle, and then they cause you to hyper-produce eggs.
Overstimulate the ovaries.
Yeah, you have some of the details that you can fill in front of you, but then
scary big words,
right? Hyper-stimulate, and then it can cause a syndrome where you get what is the syndrome?
It is ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome.
Right, which just does not sound pleasant at all. And then so it's hyperstimulate, so that you cause you to produce more than just your one or sometimes 2 monthly eggs that are released. And also, too, with that, women, the number of eggs that they're born with, that's how many you have. You don't replenish them. They're born. So even, when women are, I always talk about this, when women are pregnant with a girl baby, while they're pregnant, that little girl baby develops all of the eggs that she'll ever have in her whole life, which is crazy to think about how intricate that whole process is. But they cause them to hyper-produce these and then cause them to mature rapidly so that they can then extract them. And the extraction process is what was just disgusting and grossing me out last night. I was reading, we won't give you all those details.
There are a lot of complications associated with that extraction as well. We'll put links also in the description, too.
Well, things like perforations and bowel perforations and
cysts, sepsis, passing out from pain procedure. There's a lot.
So just the process itself often has risks with it because it's not something that's a natural process, right? This is a really icky thing that's going on. But then also there's links that they think that they have long-term side effects from those, including certain types of reproductive cancer, whether it's ovarian cancer or breast cancer, cancers of your reproductive system that can be infertility, all kinds of different things that are associated as long-term risks, which if you are young and you don't think through and you're like, oh, I can just make several $1,000s selling my eggs that I'm not using right now.
Right.
And so it's a really, years and years ago, I watched a documentary called Exploitation. It was probably 2010 that I saw this. It was a long time ago. I don't know if that's still on, but if it is, it's instead of exploitation, it's exploitation. But it was interviewing a bunch of women who had gone through that process and how terrible it was for them and how they felt like they were not properly informed about the risks.
Well, even I have heard this as a young woman, like, oh, you have so many eggs when you're young too. Like, you don't need all of them.
Right.
But when you turn a certain age, I'm pretty sure you have like half of the eggs and then it decreases like so fast after that. And you actually don't know how many you have. You can go get tests, I think. But yeah, I think the number of how many you have has also been like misconstrued, like overestimated for a lot of young women my age, I would say. Yeah.
Well, and then, I mean, I don't know, but it would seem like that would also lead to like early onset menopause and things like that too,
Right.
because if you, your body has a natural rhythm to it. And that's one of the things, once that egg supply starts, I mean, I don't know all the details again. We are not doctors, but I mean, there's just a lot of different complications, and it's exploiting women. Which this is a common theme that we see, and we'll talk about this more later on in the episode, but this is a common theme that you see in a lot of the ethical issues with anything reproductive related. So things related to different types of birth control, to abortion, to surrogacy, IVF, egg harvesting, all of these different things. There's a certain level of exploitation of women that takes place. And what's, that was with the surrogacy part of it. But even you'll have certain far left-leaning feminist organizations that will speak out on things like this because they feel like you're paying women. It's almost like a prostitution linked, right?
Yeah.
Where you're paying women for something that they're giving up part of their own body for in exchange for money.
Yeah.
That it's just an interesting, it's just icky. I mean, I have no other word for it, but
icky, and it feels like everything happens for this. I feel like in the shadows, like it's not talked about, not anywhere. Even we'll get into this too, but how like states don't want to uphold laws for this because it gets into a little bit too much bioethics for them, and so it's important to be educated on what's happening.
Well, and with all of these things that we're talking about today, and this also goes with that episode that we had on the humanized mice, right? Which if you didn't listen to that one, go back and listen to that. It was like the dark underbelly of the abortion industry or whatever. We talked about some fun topics that day too. But with all of that, it's like as science advances, just because you can does not mean that you should do certain things.
Right.
And this is all of these things that we're talking about today get into that area of, and so the egg harvesting relates both to IVF and to surrogacy because it's used, and it's also used in a lot of the stem cell research, which we talked about in that other episode.
Yes, because you can buy packages of it.
Right. So they're selling eggs, and those eggs, what are they being used for, right? They're being used to help other couples in IVF. Women who are going through IVF themselves, if they're going to use their own eggs, they have to go through that process of that egg harvesting as well. And then surrogacy and also medical research. So these are all things that are being used, all of which are gray ethically, and at least have some, even if not every single thing about these are, it's not black and white, but there's a lot of really disturbing things that happen in the industries.
Yes. And risk associated for the person going through it as well.
That are not being told the risks or not sufficiently. That's a big part of it. Right. That they're not being told how big of a risk or how painful what they might have to endure going through a process. They're just like, oh, no big deal, come do this, and you're in and out, and here's your check for however many thousands of dollars.
And it's not tracked after either, the things that the women go through.
Yes.
Yeah, which is also what makes it so iffy and dicey, because you're like, well, what's happening to them after they're going through this? So.
And I mean, it's not something you ever hear about. Until you
start looking for it.
Until you started looking for it, is probably not something that anybody listening has ever thought about or really looked into, because it's not easy to find. It's not talked about.
It's because they don't want you to know about it.
Right.
Okay, so one of the things that uses egg harvesting is we use the term IVF.
Yes.
What is IVF?
In vitro fertilization, which again, so this was something that when it first came out, right, it was like a really big deal because there were couples that struggle with fertility. I know a lot of couples, that have struggled with fertility. I know a lot of couples who've used IVF to have their babies that they have, babies that they feel like they would not have had otherwise. So again, we're not saying any kind of value judgment on anybody that has gone through, especially, a lot of the stuff that we know about IVF is more recent. I mean, things come out at the very beginning when it's brand new, and everything is always
scary. This is what we can do, right.
there are a lot of couples who use IVF because they're having trouble conceiving. It's interesting because now there are a lot of other there's sort of this new wave of medicine. Just if anybody is looking into it, that there's natural fertility doctors that are trying to give patients an option other than IVF because it's so intrusive and so expensive and does not really have that great of a rate of. I was reading that with IVF, the first round typically has like a 20 to 35% success rate. Wow. That the younger that you are, the more likely it is to be successful, and also depending on like why the person is infertile, like why they're struggling, the reasons behind that, their age. There's a lot of different factors that affect the success rate of it. But you're spending a whole lot of money. It's emotionally and physically draining, and it's just a tough thing to walk through. I know, again, a lot of people who've gone through that, and it's not an easy thing to go through, not only physically, but also emotionally. Right. And just this whole process. And there's different clinics that do them in different ways, some that try to minimize the number of discarded embryos and things like that, which we'll talk about in just one second. But there's some that, I've heard people say, oh, well, this is a clinic that only makes, certain numbers. But again, it's an expensive process that, has the success rate is low considering how much money and time is going into it. And it also then includes that egg harvesting because they have
and
to
I was like, how many eggs you're able to give too, right?
Right.
Like, So
then there's another side of it, which we'll get into in a minute, but they create an embryo, right, in a petri dish. So it's like the test tube baby kind of from, decades ago, but creating embryos in outside of the womb and then implanting one or two of them. And it just depends on how many, like they were saying that at a time, I think they can get like 8 eggs or something at a time. And, or the packages were like packages of 10 that they're creating. But so just, every clinic I think does it a little bit differently from what I was reading. Again, do your own research. Right. This is just us talking about this topic, but anything that look it up because it's fairly easy to find information. On this, there's a lot out there, but
more coming out too.
So then they implant those, but they also have to do things to implant. There's things they have to do to prep the woman to make it more likely for the egg to implant and be in there, the embryo. And there's also, depending on whether it's like your own or a donor egg, because your body tends to reject donor eggs more at a higher rate, which makes sense. It does make sense.
Right. Okay. I was like, that makes sense. Yes. Okay. So there's so much that is going into this. And there's also, like you kind of said, ethical implications too, because of how many embryos that they're able to make since they're making them in the petri dish.
Correct.
So who gets to decide the number of embryos that they're able to make, or what happens to the viable embryos if there's too many and the family doesn't want all of the viable eggs?
Well, and there's a lot of legal and ethical considerations with that because, and I think the laws vary by state. And then they have to, because they make more than they need. So then there's a certain level of eugenics that goes in there, which I don't know if you're not familiar with the term eugenics, right? It's the survival of the most fit, kind of. It's what the Nazis were trying to do and having like a master race. So when you're in the eugenics part of it is, oh no, I want girls or I want boys or I want them to have blue eyes or I want them to not have this disease or, until you start doing,
getting to pick your kid.
Which again, the ethical, underpinnings of that are really sketchy. Because who gets to decide and what traits are we doing and then what's happening to those other embryos that are created? Well, there's a whole host of things that can happen to them. They can be frozen indefinitely. And so I was reading some articles about how there's couples that every year they get a notice about whether they want to have them destroyed, whether they want to have them donated to another couple, if they want to donate them to science where they can be experimented on, or whether they want to they have to pay like $800 a year or some fee. I don't know what depending on where they're having them, there's a fee involved to keep them frozen for another year. And so you have these embryos that are, so we're not talking about, an egg and a sperm. These are embryos that have already had fertilization take place, and they're sitting there frozen, or they can be, different things can happen to them. And so depending on how each clinic does things a little bit differently from what I was reading, some do more, some do fewer, and just the whole process looks different depending on where you go as to what that is. But all of it, it's those things that you don't really think about with that whole process. It's like, here's a couple that couldn't have a baby and now they're going to have a baby, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that side of it, right? But then there's all these other things that go along with it that create
the implications with that decision.
Issues. Yes. So, I was going to say something else about that, and I don't remember what. You're talking about storing them and the eugenics side of it. Was there something else?
Because, then it just kind of answered my next question that I had, that do all embryos make it to fetal development? So not all of them will. Oh,
and then the other piece of it too with that is that, which I think they do, this is less of a problem now than it was before. But again, the eugenics part of it comes in because they tend to pick embryos that they think have a better chance of going. But what often happens if there are if they implant multiple embryos and all of them take, then sometimes that leads to, you need to have a selective termination where you abort one of them so that you don't have 3, but you only have 2, or you only have 1 instead of 2.
Yeah.
And you had a story about, that was a surrogacy one. We'll get to that with the surrogacy conversation, but which a lot of these are similar. There's some overlap in the conversation, but that does happen as well.
Yes. Which us talking reminded me of that. I wanted to ask about kind of who fathered IVF and the eugenics behind all of it, and why it kind of all started, because why were we able to do this now? Right?
Yeah, so that was something that I was not aware of. I thought this was really interesting and creepy at the same time. This was the inventor of the technology that led to the first, quote, test tube baby, right? There were 2 men, Robert G. Edwards and Patrick Steptoe. That it was Robert G. Edwards that they invented this process of in vitro fertilization.
Okay.
But actually won a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine in 2010 for that advancement in science. But he was a member of Britain's Eugenics Society. So he believed in eugenics, which again, you're right. It's this creating these perfect. It was reminding me. I don't know if you ever read The Giver.
Oh no, but I know it's a good
right.
book.
So it's like that, where you're creating these babies outside of the womb and it's just there's so many different and even now they're talking about. The advancement in science relating to all of this stuff. They're talking about artificial wombs and transplanted wombs, to where you could be a man that thinks he's a woman and take a womb from a woman and have it transplant so that you can have it gets, again,
and this
just
is
because
where
you
we
can.
Is this medicine, science? What are we doing, people?
Right.
Like
it goes into the whole humanized mice conversation, which it's like, okay, are we, just because we can do certain things in science and the advancement happens, is it the right thing to do or not? And the farther we get away from, and again, there's so much to talk about with infertility. Right. It's a huge, and it's heartbreaking, right? So it's something that a lot of couples go through. It's more and more, I feel like, which honestly, we've had conversations about that, about environmental factors and different things and the hormone levels and all kinds of things that affect your ability to conceive and carry a child. And it's a desire that God puts in us to want to do that.
Right.
But then the farther we get away from the way that God designed anything, no matter what it is, right? Anything that we do, the farther we kind of get away from the way that God designed it to work. This is a natural function. And so it's like certain medical advancements, they're great, right? They help us to cure disease and different things. But then you also get into a lot of things where it's like, this should be in the book of Revelation. Yeah. I don't know.
Does anybody know what they're doing over there? Like,
it gets really, when you're talking about taking a womb from someone and implanting it in a man so that he can, it crosses into just such.
Yeah.
I don't even have a word for
too hairy.
Yeah, really and truly. It's like, so you go from like having a noble intention, right? And I don't know whether this guy, if he was a eugenicist, he may not have had noble intentions.
Right.
But I think a lot of people who were first on board with it, right, did have noble intentions. It's great. We're going to help couples have babies that can't have babies. And there are a lot, because it's like something to the tune of over 400,000 procedures every year. So a lot of people, so many families that have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews that came out of IVF. And again, those are all children made in the image of God, and they're a blessing, no matter how they got here. Yep. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the underpinnings of like some of the dark things that go along with it. And again, every clinic is a little bit different.
Right.
So looking at the clinic, but it's just something to really look into and pray about.
Yes.
About knowing what your state's laws are related to it, especially like with the egg harvesting thing, what are the laws related to that? And we'll get into surrogacy, and that's a whole different level of stuff too.
Yeah, well, because I was like, well, this is just we would have only talked about the IVF portion of the conversation, but now where you're able to also, surrogacy is another thing. So can you explain what surrogacy is for people who might not know?
Yeah, so with surrogacy, and again, something that, there are certain noble aspects to surrogacy. I remember, so surrogacy is when one person has a baby for somebody else, right? And so, I remember being young, and the first couple of instances I ever heard of with surrogacy where it was like, okay, someone who couldn't have a baby, and so her sister carried a baby for her and I'm like, okay, that's a heartwarming story, right? This is within a family, and there's one person helping another family member who's not able to have a baby for whatever reason. And so there are certain, instances of surrogacy that are like that. But again, we're talking about the commodification part of it. So with even, just before we leave the IVF conversation, leading into the surrogacy conversation, we talked about the title was the commodification of pregnancy, which a commodification, if you don't know that word, is to turn something into a business, like into a transaction where you're exchanging money for something. And so it's a big money industry, because if you are, again, if it has a low success rate, like with IVF, and they're saying that it has a decent success rate, but to me, the amount of money and time that's spent on that and the low success rate, I understand that people are desperate to have a baby. I totally, my heart aches for that, because I know that I just wanted to have babies. I did. Yeah. And so to watch women go through those kind of fertility struggles is just heartbreaking. So I understand, 100% understand the desire and the, why people go through when they do that. Right. But then it's a big business, right? Where you're, whether it's the egg donation side, the companies that then freeze and store all of those embryos, right, leading into the scientific advances of buying these embryos for research, all of that, there's a lot of money involved in it. And so the whole issue, so many of the medical science things, when the overlap with money, it breeds greed, and you do things that are unethical in the science community, there's unethical actions for profit.
That's true.
At the expense of people who are just trying to have a baby.
Yep. Yeah.
Right?
They're playing on their sadness,
their emotions, and their
emotions.
right, and their God-given desire to have a family, right? So then you have scientific advancements that are preying on that, or like we said with the egg harvesting, preying on girls who are trying to get money to go to college or to pay their rent, and you're preying on them to line your own pockets in this commodification of the pregnancy industry, of those reproductive sciences that you talked about.
Yeah.
So getting into surrogacy, right? So now it's become a big business, and you hear about it more and more lately.
Well, now a lot of celebrities you hear are doing it too, which, are there any laws around surrogacy?
Yes. Well, every state is different in what they do. Some states have no laws on it. Some have really lenient laws where they support surrogacy, like California, for example, where a lot of the celebrities live that are doing it. Other states, it looks to me, I was a little confused about what it meant, but it looks like Arizona, it said that they don't, what was the wording?
Just a side note, when I was researching for this, I heard California described as the Wild West for surrogacy because it is so crazy out there, and a bunch of people can kind of do whatever they want.
Which we'll get into some of the really seedy pieces of that in a second. But it's Arizona. It says that surrogacy contracts are unenforceable by statute, which to me sounds like it's not outlawed, but that the courts won't uphold the contracts that are written. So it becomes unenforceable, which I would think would limit the monetary incentives for that here, because it's harder. Oh, even with going back to IVF, sorry, I'm going back to that, but there was a case several years ago related to IVF about who owns the babies, right? So you have, there were things where, a freezer went out and somebody, lost embryos that they had. But there was also one where there was a woman who'd had cancer, and this was a law, like they passed a law related to this, but a woman who'd had cancer, and so before she started undergoing chemotherapy, she had her eggs harvested, and they created embryos, because I guess the embryos are easier to freeze, I think. From my understanding, like it's easier to create the embryos ahead of time rather than just like storing eggs, right? You create embryos and store them. So she was either married or with a longtime boyfriend. I don't remember what the marital status was, but anyway, they had created these embryos. Well, so because she was afraid that going through the chemo that she would not be able to have a baby later. So then they split up, and then there was a legal battle over whose they were, because she wanted them kept and he wanted them destroyed, and it was both of theirs biologically. So how do you determine who they belong to, right? Because they technically belong to both of them. And if there's a discrepancy, so the law was created in Arizona that the law would be in favor of whoever wanted to keep them. So like if one person wanted, they could sign away their rights to them and say, okay, I don't have any financial responsibility if you create babies out of those embryos, that I'm not legally or financially responsible. I don't remember the exact details of the law, but that was basically the gist of it. Because again, it's one of those things you don't think about, right? You don't think about, okay, well, what happens if those embryos are frozen and then that couple splits up? Who owns them? And again, we're owning... It's embryos. A commodity, right? So then it's not a child, it's a commodity. It's something that you own, right? And there's legal, it just creates some really murky legal
very
and moral.
Interesting industry.
Yes. So going on to surrogacy, that you have women who are paid now to carry a baby for somebody else. And there's a whole slew of reasons why, right? Sometimes it's because of infertility. Sometimes it's celebrities that either don't want to ruin their figure, and so they want to pay someone else to have a baby for them. Or there's also a lot of women who they are delaying having children until they're in their 40s, and then they're too old to really have a baby, so they pay someone younger to have a baby for them. And there's a lot of gay male couples. That's a sort of a current trend. Pete Buttigieg, right? That hit with his partner. And you have these male, gay male couples that want to have a baby. And there's a whole other thing that's going on now where they can create there's some creepy science involved where they can
put their DNA
together where there's no actual female involved. It's really, I don't know how that works, but I don't know that I want to know because I already have looked up enough icky stuff in this.
I already know too much.
Yeah, I already know more than I want to know. Oh,
but yeah, that's also happening.
It's really not
I know.
funny, but
I did hear about that.
Oh my goodness. Anyway, so there's a lot of, and then so it again creates a lot of really ethical issues, right? Because there's a couple of situations. I know you looked up one. You had something about you had a story, right?
Yes, it was an international couple came to California to have a baby via surrogate. The mother was an American citizen. She once they implanted the embryo, it took, but she ended up being pregnant with twins. And one of the twins, through genetic testing, they found that it had a congenital heart defect, but not something that I guess was like super unfixable. Like if they had a surgery right after he was born, baby should be totally fine. But because of that risk, the family did not want to keep the child with the birth defect and wanted her to get an abortion to only carry one. And that went against her belief of having abortion. And so then it got into a legal battle, but the state did not want to make a decision also because they were an international family, all these things that got into very murky waters.
Yeah.
I do not remember how it ended up, but that's also another issue that comes with it, right? So picking and choosing also if you have more than one in the womb. Yeah.
Right. And then, so what does that mean and who gets to say so? And again, that a lot of it relates to contracts. So there's a lot of issues with, there was another case that was only a couple years ago because she was on a bunch of talk shows. I think she was on Allie Beth Stuckey and some other places where she was talking. I was trying to see if I could find her name. I don't remember, but she, I have it on here. I'll find it. That it was a surrogate mother who had been a surrogate before and didn't have any problems. And then she was a surrogate for two gay men, like there was the couple that hired her to have this baby. And everything was fine until she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so then it was this conversation with her doctors about, okay, when do we start treatment and which treatments can I do while I'm pregnant and how far along do I have to be to have the baby so that I can start this other treatment? And the cancer was more aggressive than they thought. And, this whole conversation. Well, then it created a lot of really controversial issues because they didn't want her to deliver early. They didn't want a premature baby. They didn't want the baby to be adopted. She offered to adopt the baby or have the baby placed for adoption, but they were like, no, we don't want that. We want you to abort the baby because we don't want a premature baby. We don't want to have to take care of a premature baby.
Yeah.
And so they were trying to force her to have an abortion that she didn't want to have. And then too, they were trying to get all this information. Like they were threatening to sue doctors who wouldn't give them information about her medical condition because, and it was like, who is responsible? Who gets to know what?
Right.
Because the baby, again, was their property, right? So we're talking about a commodity, right? The baby is the property of the two men, but she's the one that's pregnant. It's her body that is having. So it just creates this whole really murky medical thing. She had to fight and finally found a doctor so that nobody would induce her because the men wouldn't agree to her being induced early. So the two men that were paying her to have the baby, they wouldn't agree to have the baby delivered early. So she couldn't get the baby delivered early to get her to start her cancer treatment. And so she finally found someone that was willing to do it. And the baby ended up, but then they also had like I'm not exactly sure how it worked out because the baby ended up dying, which is tragic.
Yeah.
But also they had said that they didn't want any kind of medical intervention given to the baby. So I don't know whether the baby just died naturally or died because they had said no medical care for this baby, no medical intervention for the baby. So I don't know because that information is not really available. I don't know whether it was just something that because of the fact that she had cancer and the baby was born early, that the baby would have died no matter what. Yeah. I don't know how that worked out. But the point of the story is that it created some it brought up some really significant issues about contracts related to pregnancy, related to surrogacy, who gets to decide what, if there's something, you know, if it's like the woman's body, the woman's medical needs over the baby's, who gets to decide that, because there's a contract involved that's legal. It just creates a lot of really difficult, because again, this is not something that we're stepping far away from God's plan for things. So then it creates a lot of legal and ethical issues related to surrogacy. And there's also a bunch of issues of, this is another thing where some left-leaning feminist groups have major issues with surrogacy because they feel like it exploits women, and that there's a new trend where they're paying a lot of foreign women, especially Asian women, who are poor, and they are paid to come be a surrogate for a wealthy couple. And so then it's like you're exploiting, it's a rich versus poor exploitation, exploiting women. So from their standpoint, even though they don't see the other sort of ethical issues that we're talking about today, they also see it as an ethical problem because it's the exploitation of women.
Yeah. Oh, man, I did find her name. It was Brittany Pearson.
Okay, Brittany what?
Brittany Pearson.
So if you want to look that story up, you can look up her whole story.
Very
she did some interviews.
And the laws that came out of that.
Yeah, she did interviews. Yeah, and it's a growing trend, right? Because you have, again, Pete Buttigieg and his... I don't know. Are they married? Is it? I don't know. Anyway, whatever. And they're not the only couple, right? There's other couples that have that, but it's like that was even one. Did you see the SNL skit where they were mocking that?
No.
Oh my gosh, it was funny. Not him specifically, but they were like, okay, where did this baby come from? You know, it was one of those things where. When it's starting to become an SNL topic of, you know,
you're like, okay, what are we doing?
It's enough of a cultural phenomenon that it becomes an issue, right? To talk about. So, but it's such a dicey thing. And again, are these women doing it knowing that they're going into a contract and that if something happens that they may not be able to get cancer treatment if it interferes with what the parents of the baby want? Correct. Right. So how do those contracts, what does the state law say? And again, is it commodifying babies and women, right? That they're now property, which can be discarded, which can be mistreated, which can be sold for research, which can be destroyed, which can be, paid to be aborted, whatever the case is, right? The more that sort of becomes a transactional in whichever aspect of this we're talking about, the more that it becomes transactional, the more dehumanizing it becomes for both the women and the babies involved.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. That's true. Okay. My last question was, where do we see reproductive science heading? Is there...
Well, and that was where I said about the artificial wombs is another one thing that I've seen kind of tossed around. And again, I mean, you look at any dystopian, there's a bunch of dystopian novels where it talks about, like The Giver was one. I need to reread that. But I think babies were all born in like a test tube kind of environment where there weren't any, they were just created in a lab and they were assigned to certain... And some of them were destroyed, killed, and others were allowed to live. And I don't remember. I need to reread that book. But I know that was part of what was going on in that book. And there's been, there's a lot of... It gets, again, the more that you are commodifying, I use that term several times, but the more that pregnancy becomes a commodity, the more that babies become a commodity, then they are... disposable. They can be bought for a price, right? Whether this is a girl selling her eggs or whether it's someone being paid to, have a baby without fully knowing what they're getting into or...
And it's important to be aware of the information that's being pushed on the women that are out there too, because they don't sometimes see the implications for themselves or what may happen down the road, or nobody tells them
Right.
either. So just being able to know what's out there and to
talk about
it and research it, because it's out there. You just have to look.
Right. And again, too, if you have, if you are struggling with infertility too, I do know that there are, again, there are
Like
natural things that people, there's been some success with trying, because again, your body is designed for that process, right? So if there's something wrong, there's so many environmental things with hormones and all kinds of things that are wrong.
Right.
But they've had a lot of success with some of these natural fertility things where then people do not have to go the route of IVF because they're finding other ways to do it, which are better for your body, for one thing. But again, it's just something to look into, right? So if you're having, if you have thought about going that route, or people who are getting ads for selling their eggs or whatever that is, to do your own research, look into it. We're not telling you, do this or don't do that. Just trying to have a conversation about some of these things that really are not talked about and that a lot of people have not looked into, and say, do your own research, look up some of this stuff, find out what this is. Different clinics do different types of procedures and have different rules about what they do and don't do.
States have different rules.
States have different rules.
Yep.
So know what you're getting into before you go into any of those.
Or sign any contracts.
Right.
It's true.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, thank you. And thanks, Debbie.
I know. So now it's like, all kinds of stuff. So we'll pick out a couple of these, links to look. But again, really, we want you to do your own research, look up stuff, ask some questions, go into more of it. We just kind of highlighted on some things today. There's so much more involved in this that needs to be looked at and prayed about, and just really be aware of what this is, and try to, know that women's bodies, babies are a gift. They're not a commodity. And so we need to be treating them as such and making sure that we're valuing that gift of pregnancy and childbirth, and not treating it like it's a commodity. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify, and follow us on social media to find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.